What's going on, everyone? Welcome back to another episode of the H Panel, the show where I bring on guests from all different backgrounds to talk all the things mental health. I'm your host, Harry Potvin, and today I have the pleasure of being joined by Eric Zimmer. Eric is a behavioral coach, a certified interfaith spiritual director, and the host of the award-winning podcast, The One You Feed. His Spiritual Habits program helps bring together the science of habit building and spiritual principle wisdom to help create spiritual habits in his clients' lives. Eric was so fun to talk to, and I wanted to thank him again for coming on and having this discussion with me. We also talk about his addiction and his journey to recovery, and as substance abuse cases rise up, I know we had one in my hometown particularly heartbreaking, but I feel like his advice and his insight really is valuable at this moment. Now, before we get started here, guys, please like, comment, share, subscribe, give 5 stars on podcast platforms, share with someone who might need to hear this episode. It's a really great one, and I can't wait for you to listen. I hope you all have a beautiful day, and I'll talk to you all very soon. Peace. I'm Harry Potvin, and this is the H Panel. We are live. Eric, thank you so much for joining me today, man.
Thank you for having me on. I'm happy to be here.
So before we get into anything, I wanted to get to know you a little better. So what got you into behavioral coach work? Like what inspired you to go down that path?
Well, I think the real primary beginning was when I got sober from heroin addiction at 24. That was, I think, that really launched me into a world of where I had to really pay attention and think about, how do we make change? How do I change? What are the ways that we make profound change in our life? So I think recovery is what got me into it. Then I realized I was really interested in it, that and spiritual matters. And so I was sort of interested in that for the next, I don't know, 15, 20 years or so, while I worked a career. I was in the software industry for a lot of years, software startup companies. I founded a solar energy company. And then when the solar energy company, I had to shut it down, I just was kind of bored, and I was like, well, what do I want to, what do I want to do next? Not necessarily for a career, but just what do I feel like doing? And the idea of doing a podcast where I talk to people about, behavioral changes and personal development and spiritual life just sounded fun to me. So I kind of launched the podcast for fun, and now I think we're 7 years old now. And so, years later, after doing the podcast for a while, that led to starting to do some of the coaching work, which I realized, oh, I've done this before. In AA, we have a sponsor, right? It's a sponsor similar to a coach. And then eventually things went well enough that it's what I'm able to do full time now for the last few years.
Awesome. Yeah, so your podcast is named The One That Feeds, right?
The One You Feed.
The One You Feed. What inspired that name?
Well, there's a parable that it goes like this. Without, I guess I have to do the parable for it to make any sense. There's the grandfather's talking with his grandson. He says there's two wolves inside of us that are always at battle. One is a good wolf, which represents things like kindness and bravery and love. And the other is a bad wolf, which represents things like greed and hatred and fear. And the grandson stops and he thinks about it for a second, and he asks his grandfather, well, grandfather, which one wins? And the grandfather says, the one you feed. So that's the name of the podcast, The One You Feed. It's, basically about the fact that, which of those wolves are we feeding leads to our happiness, contentment, success, whatever you want, right? It's basically, when you hear the parable, you get it right away. It's, our choices matter. What we think about, what we do matters.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, 100%. I love that name. So how do we get to feed the right wolf? Like, where do we start in order to feed that good side?
Well, that's a big question depending on in what sense, but I think it's all starts with knowing what that means for us. What does feeding the good wolf mean for us? What does living a good life mean to us? What matters to us? And I think that's the primary place we have to start. What matters to us? And knowing ourselves, what things when I do them make me feel good, what things when I do them make me feel bad, what things bring me satisfaction, what things don't. So first we have to know kind of what we want, where we want to go, and then sort of assess what, well, are the things in my life, are they taking me towards more of those things that are important to me, that matter to me, that are good, or are they not? Sometimes it's kind of obvious. When I was 24 years old and I was a homeless heroin addict, it's pretty obvious I'm feeding the bad wolf.
Mm.
um, but in a lot of our lives, it's more subtle. So I think knowledge of what we want, where we want to go, and then self-awareness. Where am I? What am I doing? You know, what's actually happening? And then that can point us in some directions. But feeding the good wolf means really different things to different people. Although I think we can say that, kind of across the board, we've got a lot of, there's some real clear pointers out there that we can look at. There's lots of people who have led lives that we can look at and go, oh, okay, that looks like a life well lived.
Yeah, yeah, 100%. So I wanted to kind of go backwards a little bit here, sorry, and go back to your addiction. So when you were in that state, what kind of clicked to for you to go get that help? Like what changed?
Well, it's a $1 million question, and I say that because if you could figure out clearly, you would be a multimillionaire if you could just figure out how to get everybody out of addiction, right? So it's not an easy question. It's I can only share kind of what happened to me, and even that is an interpretation. But it was a period of over a couple of years of beginning to realize like this isn't working for me, and beginning to try and get help. So I had been in treatment a couple times before I actually stayed sober, kind of that last time. So I've been to treatment a few times. I've been to a bunch of meetings. I'd tried moving here. So I tried all these different things and they didn't work. Um, the thing that was the big thing for me was I got arrested. Well, I was homeless, which is bad enough, but apparently that wasn't bad enough. But I got arrested and I was looking at, potentially 50 years of jail time. And and when I got arrested, I had been sleeping in the back of a van. I lost that van. I lost the job I'd had, which was providing me a lot of the money for my habit, along with the crimes I was committing. And I just was out of ideas. And so I said, I'll go to detox, just because I was kind of freaked out. I didn't know what else to do. I didn't know where to get more money. And I just thought, I'll just go to detox. And while I was there, they said, we think you need to go into longer term treatment. And I originally said no. And then I went back to my room there, and I just had one of those moments in recovery, call them a moment of clarity. And the moment of clarity was, I'm going to die if I go back out there. I weighed 100 pounds. I had hepatitis C. I was really sick. I was in bad shape. And so in that moment, I just decided to go into longer term treatment. And from there, I think hope started to build a little bit. I do think that there's two things we can look at in for recovery to take or work with people. We talk a lot about consequences, right? We all have that idea, an addict's got to hit bottom. So consequences are important, but I know people who have had consequences that would make everybody listening to this podcast like, hide their head like, God, how could you possibly go through that and still use? And yet they go on and on. And for a lot of addicts, the consequence is death. So consequence is part of it. But the other part, I think, is hope. And so I think what happened was I had enough consequence to put me in a place, and then I got exposed to enough hope. And the hope was, oh, I could really live a different way. This can actually happen. And so I think those two things together provide a fertile ground that recovery can grow out of. So I think that's kind of what happened in my case. And I've seen it happen that way for a lot of other people also.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad you're clean, man. Like I hear a lot of addiction stories like with friends and like people that my family knows, people that my friends know. And it's like I think what a lot of people forget is like, you know, uh, people who are addicted, they're just thrown away by society so quickly. They're just people just assume that they're choosing that lifestyle and like whatever, but some people actually have like in their brain it's like I need this for me, and it's like they've convinced themselves of that, and people just don't get that. So I feel like it's important to shine light on the fact that they're people too. It's just their brain's kind of against them, for lack of a better
Their
term.
their brain's totally against them. Yeah. I mean, addiction is I mean, at the end of the day, the person does have to decide, finally make a decision. I'm not going to do this anymore, right? But the to say that those people have free will around addiction in the same way that somebody who's not addicted is just not accurate, right? Because what happens is that there's a series of things that go wrong in addiction, but one of them certainly is that the brain itself starts to change. You damage the brain. You actually damage the parts of the brain that are capable of saying, this is a bad idea, maybe I shouldn't do it. So there's a whole host of factors. And then a lot of times people with addiction, there's trauma issues from their background. There's a huge amount of mental illness that goes along with addiction. So yeah, we need more treatment options for people. That needs to be the way that we orient. And yes, we also need consequences in certain cases for people. So
Yeah.
it's a very tricky, it's not an easy thing to solve, like, which is why I said it's sort of a multi-million dollar question, because if you actually knew how to solve it, you'd be richer than, you know, you probably wouldn't be richer than Bill Gates, but you should be.
Yeah, seriously. Well, that's my next endeavor. I'm going to solve addiction, just casually on the side.
Just get back to me once you've got that solved. That would be helpful.
Yeah.
Let me know.
So in your 7 years of doing the podcast,
Yeah.
what is like what's the best advice that you would take and give your younger self?
Hmm. Well, three or four things popped to mind, but I'll just pick one. Um, you are not your feelings.
Mm, yeah, I like
You
that
know,
one.
you are not your feelings. There's you, and then you're kind of the space that these feelings happen in. And if we can get a little distance from them, a little space from them, it can make such a huge difference. um Lots of things come out of that ability to sort of do that, to make that delineation. A lot of really positive things come out of it. So that, if I had to put it down into sort of one thing, that might be it.
Hmm. I like that advice. I know a lot of people. Actually, I'm not even going to mention it because it's a point that I want to get to later. But so I wanted to talk about your new program, Spiritual Habits. So,
Hmm.
what inspired you to make this program?
Yeah. So Spiritual Habits is a program that was my attempt to, um, what it is the combination of what I would consider to be spiritual principles that are widely agreed on by every major religion out there, most anybody who's wise, most philosophical traditions, things that everyone would go, yeah, yeah, it's good. You should do that. Generosity. Yeah, generosity, that's good. No argument. Right. And but what I looked at with spiritual principles is I went, well, they tend to be things that we believe in, or things that we go, oh, yeah, I should do that. Or we hear it on a podcast. We're like, I need to do more of that, but then we don't.
Mm,
So what I did, so spiritual habits is an attempt to marry those ideas to what we know about behavior science, with an attempt to bring them together so that we can actually start to live these spiritual principles out in our lives, because that's where they're actually useful. They're not so, I mean, they're great ideas, but they make a real difference in our lives when we live them. So for example, being present more often to the moments of our lives, another principle that everybody would go, yeah, that's a good idea, right? But it only is helpful if we're actually present to more moments of our lives. So it's an attempt to take what we know about behavior science and wed it with these principles so that we can we can live them more fully.
mm. What is a what is a spiritual habit? Like, is it basically just a normal habit, or?
Kind of. So what I've done is, what a spiritual habit would be something like, um here's one. So we talked about presence, being more present to the moments of your lives, kind of recognizing that most of us are always lost in thought. We're always, on our way somewhere else. We're always waiting for a better moment to come. So let's say being present. So a spiritual habit for that would be something like grounding yourself in your senses. So grounding yourself in your senses is a practice where you just stop and you look around and you go, what are five things I can hear right now? What are five things I can see right now? What are five things that I can feel in my body right now? So we've given you an actual way to practice that habit. And then we talk about, in the same way we would with any habit, right? If you want to make a habit happen, you need to be specific about, when am I going to do it? What am I going to do? How am I going to be reminded to do it? How am I going to keep track of whether or not I did it? And if I keep doing it regularly enough, it'll start to become more ingrained. So one of the other ideas in spiritual habits is this phrase I love. I think it's an old Tanzanian proverb, but it says, "Little by little, a little becomes a lot." And so, most of us are in a position where we might be like, well, I do want to grow in my wisdom, in my compassion, in my ability to be present, in my spiritual life, if that's a term you want to use. I do want to grow, but I can't really just go off to, an ashram in India for 6 months, because I've got a life. I'm busy. I've got lots going on. So for people like that, which I am one of, it has to be that little by little, right? Little by little. So practicing little moments of spiritual practice throughout our day. Meditation is a great spiritual habit, but it's still something that most people do once a day. Okay, I meditate in the morning for 30 minutes. That's great. I mean, that's a really good foundational practice. Lots of people struggle to ever get to that, but it's 30 minutes out of your whole day. So what we want to do is find ways to weave these things into more moments of your day. So grounding yourself in your senses is a spiritual habit.
Mm.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I like that because I know, well, myself included, like when I started doing like meditation and trying to get to these spiritual habits that you're talking about going, I always had that excuse come up where it's I don't have the time.
Yep.
But it's pretty like a little, like you said, a little becomes a lot. Like you can, and I mentioned this before, but I know a girl who I had a discussion with, and she hated meditating, like she couldn't stand it. But what she did was, when she was doing her daily, like whatever, like her routine, she would just listen to the guided meditation in her head like every day, and it would slowly start to become a habit for her, and then eventually she got so accustomed to it that she just started meditating.
Oh, that's a great example. Yeah. Yep, it is. It's sort of, little by little, little becomes a lot. It's the only option most of us have, because it's just, we don't have a lot of time. We're not Most of us are not, in a lot of cases, that's not an excuse. And sometimes it is, but in a lot of cases it's not. We don't have a lot of time, you know? So we have to be judicious about how we spend the time we do have, and we have to find, what we would call, an on the spot practice. And on the spot practice just means something that I do right wherever I'm at in the middle of my day. And a lot of what we're after in spiritual practice and principles is, it's about how we relate to and respond to and connect with the world. So we can only practice it really when we're out engaged in the world. Meditation is great, but our compassion and our wisdom and our ability to keep perspective and all these things, they only can be grown, as we engage.
Hmm. Yeah,
Yeah.
I like that. So how does one, let's say, uh, stop, like how does one get to this point and stop their negative habits, like that get in the way? Let me fix that up. So like, let's say you have a phone addiction, or you eat, like you have an overeating problem, like you just
Mhm.
black out and eat whatever you can, and it's like a nasty habit. So how do we
Yeah.
eliminate that and kind of gear that energy towards these spiritual habits that you're talking about?
Yep. Well, let me give some general advice, and everybody's a little bit different, but I can give some general ideas, right? I mean, the first is to get clarity on, okay, what do I want to change and why? So we've got to have some real degree of clarity on why it matters. So, for example, you might have said, okay, I've got a phone addiction, and the problem with that is that it's not allowing me to do these other things. Or after I spend 3 hours on my phone, I feel terrible. Or, some variation on it. So why does it matter? Getting clarity on why it matters. And then um, setting up ways of, what am I going to do instead? So When I get home from work, instead of picking up my phone and scrolling Facebook, instead, I will put on a podcast I want to listen to, or I will go for a walk, or, so we can't just take a behavior away. There's something known as the habit loop. And the habit loop says that there are three components to a habit. There's a trigger, right? Or a stimulus of some sort. There's a routine, and then there's the reward. So the trigger might be I'm stressed. The routine is I eat junk food, and the reward is I feel a little bit better. Now, the problem for most of us, and this is where addiction goes wrong, is that last part, I feel better, all of a sudden over time it stops. You don't feel much better,
Mm.
but yet you still have the habit loop, right? That's the weird thing about all this stuff, is it's almost as if our that information about what happens doesn't get updated. A lot of people refer to addiction these days, and addiction is a spectrum, right? We could all be somewhat addicted on certain levels. Is that addiction is a learning disorder, and that learning disorder is I don't learn. Once upon a time, I ate and I felt better, but now I eat and I just feel terrible about myself. But for some reason, my brain is not updating that. It's not getting that idea. It still keeps doing it as if will work, and it doesn't really anymore, or it does for a couple minutes. So one way of working with a habit is to realize that the trigger is not going to go away. The stress is not necessarily going to go away. Now we can talk about managing it, but there's going to be a trigger. Or for people who are trying to stop drinking, let's say 5 o'clock comes, they get off work, boom, there's the trigger. Happens every day, right? So you get the trigger. The routine is I take a drink, and the reward is I now feel like I've transitioned from work. So in the habit loop, you swap out that middle piece. All right, 5 o'clock comes. What do I do instead that's going to give me some sense of having transitioned from work? So we can't just yank something out and not do it. We've got to give it something else. That old phrase, nature abhors a vacuum, is really true in this case. So that's one really big thing we can do. The second thing that we can do is we can work on what emotions am I feeling at that moment. So I've decided that instead of, take a drink at 5 o'clock, I'm going to instead do 15 minutes of yoga. And, I get back from work, and all of a sudden I'm really craving a drink, and I'm feeling really stressed, and I'm feeling really anxious. So then we need to work on our emotional regulation skills. And emotional regulation just means my ability to feel what I'm feeling, allow it to be okay, allow it to be there, but then act according to what I value. And so in this case, what I value is not drinking. So, oh, I'm anxious. Okay. All right. It's okay to be anxious. I don't like it, but I can handle it. I can make space for it. I can allow the anxiety to be here, and then I can still go get on the yoga mat instead of pick up a drink. And then finally, I think that with bad habits, support can be really helpful. Having some people that we can talk to and encouragement about what we're doing. I often think about, like, smoking is really hard to quit. It's notoriously hard to quit. And I think it's interesting because people who have a serious smoking addiction, they've been doing it every day for decades. They just go, well, I'm going to have to quit. And they keep trying. Somebody who's had a serious alcohol addiction for decades usually goes and gets help. And that help almost always consists of some sort of group that is of other people who are trying to do the same thing, who support them. So, can we find in our own lives some measure of that also? So, those are a couple basic ideas about ways to unwind bad habits.
And what if you don't have a great support system?
Well, if you don't have a great support system, that you might put that on your I want to build a good support system as a new new project I want to take. But there's tons of things online these days. I'm kind of amazed by the number of online support groups there are that can actually be really helpful.
Mm-hmm.
So you might just take your, you know, emotional eating support group, put it in Google, and I'm almost certain you'd find lots of good resources.
Mm-hmm. It's the beauty of social media now, right? Like there's a great side and a terrible side, but the great
Yep.
side is that there's communities everywhere.
Yep. Yep. That is one of the really good sides is there are a lot of communities that we can plug into. We might be a little nervous about doing so, but it can be a real um, helpful extra tool. And again, it just depends on, are we talking about a bad habit? Are we talking about, an addiction? And again, those things are on a spectrum. I think we used to believe, certainly when I got sober, we believed there was a point that, you just were a hard drinker, and then all of a sudden there was a point where you were an alcoholic, and that those two things were fundamentally different from each other. And I would now say I don't think that's really true. I think they're just on a spectrum. These things are on a spectrum, so depending on where you are on the spectrum, you may need more or less help. What I just said may work perfectly. You might go, oh great, let me try that, and it works. On the other hand, you might need to go into long-term treatment like I did. So it just kind of depends where you are on the spectrum.
Yeah. I think another thing people don't understand is like when someone gets clean and then they relapse, people always go like, "What are you doing? You were fine." I think people just assume that once you're recovered, that's it.
Yep.
You'll never go back.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think one of the things that we don't like to talk about very often is that sometimes, particularly early in recovery, things get worse before they get better. And what I mean by that is most of us are using these things for a reason. They are our coping skills. I'm not saying they're a good coping skill, but they're the ones we've got. And you take that coping skill away, and all of a sudden you're presented with all these emotions that you're like, whoa, I don't know what to do with this. I feel worse. You know, I often feel worse, particularly if you stop before, like when I got sober twice. I got sober at 24 from heroin addiction that we talked about. And then I stayed sober about 8 years. And then I started drinking again and smoking pot. I never went back to heroin. But I mean, I was in bad shape again. Not the same kind of bad shape. I wasn't homeless. Matter of fact, I was making more money than I'd ever made. I was driving a convertible BMW. I mean, I was doing great on the outside, and on the inside I was like, shit, I'm in as much trouble as I was in before. um and so the first time, my life was so bad that as soon as I started getting sober, it started getting better, because my addiction had taken me to such a bad point. The second time, it actually was really hard, because my addiction hadn't gotten so bad, at least as far as certain consequences, that when I gave up alcohol, I just felt worse a lot of the time. And so that happens a lot of time, which is why, recovery programs can be so helpful and so important, because then not only do they teach us how to stop using, they teach us how to start changing the way we relate to the world. And that's kind of the whole game. Um, so people who use again, it's usually they haven't fully figured that process out. They haven't fully figured out how to relate to the world from a sober perspective. And so, yeah, I agree with you. And a lot of times, relapse is, or a slip, if we learn from it, it can be a stepping stone towards recovery. That's not an encouragement for people to go relapse. It just means that's often the way it works. It was that way for me before I got sober that first time. I mean, I got sober for a week, a month, these periods of time, and then I would use again. And each of those I learned something about what worked and what didn't.
Hmm. Yeah. Well, recovery for anything isn't linear, right?
That's a great way to, yes, absolutely. Yep.
Yeah, I feel like a lot of people misunderstand that. I like I can't relate to addiction at all, but like when I was getting recovery for mental health, like I just assumed that everything was going to be fine the whole way up. And like I went to the therapist and I was like, I need you to fix me, and she was like, it's not how that works. And then so like when I got the medication, I was like for my antidepressants, I was like, I'm gonna be good. Like I'm gonna take this pill, I'm gonna be super happy. And then my emotions started going like this, and recovery started going like this, and I had great days, but then I had really bad days. But then eventually it gets to a point where it like kind of levels out almost, but it's never linear.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. It is not linear. There is, I think that a lot of things, if I were to look at like my overall mental health, I would say you'd see, if you're looking at a chart, it would be going upwards towards the right, I guess, if you're looking at a chart, the way that, but if you zoom in, it would be like lots of this. You zoom out far enough, you're like, oh, things look like they're definitely trending in the right direction. But if you zoom in close enough and you look at like 2 weeks, you'd be like, whoa, what's going on there? There's a lot of variability.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, man. Yeah, I I want people to understand that because I know a lot of people who they they want to get help, and then when they get the help and then they don't recover immediately, they get so discouraged and they just fall right back into it.
Yep. Yeah, the other thing about mental health recovery, I'm a lifelong depressive, so I have that, I get to carry that card as well. Um, is that, if medication is the route that you need to go, and a lot of people that's the route they need to go, figuring out the right medication and the right dose of medication can take some time. There's no science to it. It's not a good science. So, and then also figuring out what things help me, what things don't help me. Like I do well when I, for example, eat certain foods. I don't do well when I eat certain foods. I do well when I get a certain amount of sleep. So, I mean, for me, it's been, me in depression, I've really looked at it as I often joke, like I just throw the kitchen sink at it, like everything I know,
Hmm.
which in medication is part of that. And, but yeah, it can take time to figure that out. So I always say to people, whether it's you're trying to get sober, whether you're dealing with depression, like keep trying. In AA, they have a phrase, it's the most commonly used phrase probably, which is keep coming back. And all they mean by that is, come on, keep trying. Just keep coming. We'll figure this out. Same thing with mental health. Just keep coming, keep trying, keep experimenting, you're right. Like, don't give up. It can be, I get how discouraging it can be, because you go to the doctor and you're like, oh, finally, someone's going to fix me. And then it doesn't happen, you know, it can be really discouraging, but it's worth continuing to explore because there's lots of options. I mean, I have a good friend who suffered depression way worse than I suffered it. The you know multiple suicide attempts. I found him twice after having tried to kill himself. Couldn't find anything that worked for him for years. And then he got I don't know what they call the thing. It's basically a vagus nerve stimulator
Mm.
that stimulates the vagus nerve. He was like a different person. I was like, whoa, that was amazing. So I think continuing to try different things is really important.
The vagus nerve stimulate. What is that? Is it like an injection, a patch?
No, it's a device that is actually installed that turns on every 3 seconds and just gives a slight stimulation
Wow.
to, I believe, the vagus nerve. Yeah. And yeah, it's great. Yeah. I mean, now obviously that is not intervention number 2 on the list, right?
Right. Yeah.
Obviously, that's after years of serious, just crippling depression that you're like, well, okay, I'm willing to try that,
Hmm.
but in his case, it turned out to be a really powerful thing. So
Yeah.
my point being, it's just important to keep trying because the first few things you try may work, they may not, but there are lots of tools in the toolkit.
Hmm. Yeah. 100%. So what about those people who just kind of shrug their habits or their, depression off and just say like, I was born this way, this is who I am, and like who don't want to go seek help? Because it's one thing to like suggest it, but you can only do so much to someone that who's struggling, right? It's all about them wanting to go. So where do those guys start?
Well, I don't think they want to start. They're probably not listening to this show.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, they probably
I
aren't.
mean, honestly, they're just probably not listening to this show.
Yeah.
It, it's usually those of us around those people that really want them to change. Um, but if somebody's not ready, somebody's just not ready. If somebody doesn't want to doesn't want to try, I largely abandoned trying to get anybody to do that years ago. Although I had a really good friend a couple years ago after years of sobriety kind of went back out and it really tested that ability of mine to be like, well, if he's not ready, he's not ready. Like, because of course you want to intervene and help the people you love and you care about. And it's terrifying, you know. But I don't know what you do with people who don't, who don't want to change. What I think is what you just described is when someone is like, recognize there's a problem and they just go, that's just the way I am. And they don't want to change it. It's very often that they don't believe they can change.
Mm-hmm.
So that might be the place to start the work is on, is there any way to get that person? Well, okay, maybe you can't change because that's just the way you are. But what if you could? Just imagine that this thing could go away. Would you be happier? I know you don't believe you could, but if you could, what do you think? And just kind of explore what's the person believe? What do they think about it? Because oftentimes people just don't believe they can. So when I went to treatment the first time and I got out and I went back and I started using heroin again, it was a really dark time. And the reason it was a really dark time is I thought, well, I tried. I went to treatment. I did what they said and it didn't work. So I guess that old statement of an addict is always an addict is true. And I'm just going to die this way. It was a dark place because I didn't think I could get better because I thought I had done what there was to do. It was only in when when I got more desperate, and B, when people said, well, of course you only went, like, going to treatment one time does not mean like you will never get it. Just means your first attempt didn't work. Keep coming back, you know? Um, so some people they just don't want to change. They're not in a position they want to change. The pain is not enough to change. But a lot of times there's a deep underlying fear. I won't be able to. And it's better just to sort of slough it off and be like, hey man, I'm cool with the way it is because I'm afraid if I try, it won't happen. And so for those people, it's really about, okay, starting to get, it's why I said earlier, consequence is part of it, knowing that things aren't going well, but hope is the second critical part. If you don't believe you can change, you're not going to try.
Mm-hmm. So it's just a matter of like, if you're a peer, like obviously you can't be like, you have to do this, but maybe like trying to baby feed them signs of hope almost.
Yeah, I mean, I just think it's, what people who, let's say you've got an addict in your life who's, got a real problem and it's obvious to everybody, perhaps, but them. First is they probably know, they just don't want to deal with it. And so what those people need, my experience is they need love and understanding. They don't need somebody trying to tell them what they have to do, but a friend who can be like, yeah, man, what do you think? You know, what are your feelings about it? What if you could get better? Just, enter it with curiosity. Anytime we enter I think that anytime somebody shows up in the room with us and they have an agenda for us, our defenses come up. Doesn't matter who it is, what it is, we don't like it.
Mm-hmm.
Addicts are no different. Matter of fact, addicts are far more sensitive to it because they are exposed to it all the time. Everybody has an agenda for them, which is to stop using. I mean, I'm not blaming family members. Of course, you want them to stop, but they're very sensitive to it, and also they usually very well know what's wrong, and they're very ashamed of it. So I think it's a matter of trying to get that person to engage in meaningful discussion about what's really going on and what might they want and what are they afraid of and what are their hopes, and
Yeah.
but doing it in a way that just doesn't feel like you have such an agenda.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's so true. Like when people try to give you advice and like it comes from a good place, immediately you're like, I'm not gonna do that.
Right. Yep. Yep. The more stubborn you are, the worse that is. But I think we all have some element of that, And I'm not saying that if you do what I just suggested, that's going to make the addict get sober. I mean, God only knows. Like, there's no answer to that. How do I get? I've been asked. I would exaggerate if I said 1,000 times in my life, but lots of times in my life by people. How do I get my son, my husband, my boyfriend, my whatever to stop using? And I don't know. They're like, should I kick him out or let him stay? I don't know. There's no answer to that. There's no right answer. It's the reason, it's the reason that living with somebody who's an addict will make you insane, because, like, literally it will make you mentally ill because you're trying to solve a problem you can't solve. There's no logic involved at all. And there's no telling. For some people, if you kick the addict out of the house, that's exactly what they need. And for other people, that doesn't, it's not a question that has an answer, which is extraordinarily frustrating.
Hmm. Yeah. Well, it's like what we said about addicts and people with depression as well. It's trial and error again for the people who are supporting,
Yeah.
right?
Totally. What I think is most important if you have an addict in your life or whatever is that you find, how do you stay sane through the process? How do you get support and help? It's a reason that a couple years after AA started in the 30s, Al-Anon started, which was a program for the wives of alcoholics, because what people realized was like, holy shit, these families were sick. Like they got sick by living around an alcoholic. It causes mental illness. And so now a lot of people will be like, I don't have the problem. He has the problem. He's the alcoholic, which is totally true. And yes, you also have a problem, because you've been in that crazy environment and you've been trying to figure out how to make a crazy environment work. It's like if you're a child and your mother is crazy, you're going to become crazy sooner or later.
Hmm.
It's just proximity. It's just you're going to be trying to figure out, how do I navigate this crazy situation? The answer is there's no good way to navigate it. You need help. We need help in dealing with it. So I always, when people are like, how do I get the addict sober? I usually turn my attention to, how can we help you? Because I mean, living with an addict, living with somebody, not even living with, but having someone you love be destroying their life like that, it's awful to be part of. It's awful to watch.
Hmm. Yeah, it's got to be draining.
Oh, yeah, it's terrifying, particularly nowadays, God, with like the overdose rates of heroin. I mean, it's really scary out there.
Hmm.
You know, I'm glad I was a heroin addict in the early 90s. I mean, I don't know if I would have lived today. It's a scare. It's, just the strength of it and the fentanyl and all. I mean, it's just dangerous out there now. It is dangerous. And I mean, it was always dangerous. I had multiple people I know who overdosed and died. So I'm not saying that overdoses didn't happen in my day, but they didn't happen at the frequency they happen now.
Hmm. Yeah, the whole fentanyl issue is just a completely different animal. I've like when I was in university, like the amount of overdoses, even in weed, of just fentanyl, like in street weed and street
Wow.
drugs, it's nuts. It's such a big problem because like it just a little bit, that's all it takes. And
Yeah.
like, these people are just throwing it in. It's nuts.
Yeah, yep. It really is it's a different world in that way. It's very dangerous.
Yeah. So going back, like kind of touching what you just mentioned. So like these overdose numbers are rising, and like with them, like domestic abuse is rising, suicide rates are rising. All these numbers are rising, and a big part of that has to do with this pandemic. Because you get everything taken away from you, or like you lose your job, or you lose like your ability to go see people, your outlets. Like they just took our outlets away, and they didn't add anything to replace them. You know what I mean? Like gyms, like therapy sessions, massage parlors, like everything you would go exert your stress into, they just got rid of them. And then they're like, we don't understand why these numbers are rising. It's like, well, it's pretty obvious. So how do we lower these numbers? Like what's the first step for these numbers to get down?
Well, I think the pandemic exacerbated trends that were already there. The overdose numbers have been going up for years. The mental health numbers have been going up for years. I mean, we live in a society that is not really very mentally healthy. Now, is it worse than it used to be, or are we just getting more reports of it? Do we understand it more? I can't fully answer those questions, but it does seem to be that as a society, we are becoming more mentally sick, and drug addiction is just another variation of that. So I think the pandemic exacerbated that. So and I think that the reading that I've done, the research that I've done, the people I've talked to, the most valid theory I've heard of why this is all happening is what I would say, and I'm not making this term up. It would be sort of an epidemic of meaninglessness,
Mm,
right? And I think we're seeing a really fundamental shift over the last 50 years that humans for a long, long time, we kind of knew what we believed in. And it was largely uh, our religion, our mythology, our tribal things. I mean, I'm not saying all that stuff was good, right? But you kind of knew what you believed in. You were kind of told what mattered, what was important, and you kind of knew what your life was going to be like. You were most likely going to grow up where your family grew up. You were most likely going to do a career similar to what they were going to do, you know. But in the last 100 years, all that has changed. Religion is. I mean, if you just look at the charts about people that are involved in organized religion, they're just plummeting, which some people would argue is a great thing. And I would say there are some good things about that, but I would not say as a whole it's a great trend. Secondly, we might live anywhere we want. We might be anybody we want, right? I mean, we can change our gender now. 100 years ago, that just was not happening. And so though I would say that all that stuff's a double-edged sword. We can create our own meaning, our own life, what we want to be, who we want to be, all that, which is wonderful. And it is paralyzing too. And if we get stuck in the middle, and stuck in the middle means that we don't know what matters to us, we don't have any anchors, then I think what starts to happen is this mental illness is rising addiction rates. Another way to look at it is lack of connection. Connection. What are we connected to? And so I think the answer to these things is finding what matters to me, what meaning, you know, um, and then connection. That connection can be to yourself, it can be to your friends, it can be to your partner, it can be to your children, it can be to your community, it can be to God. I mean, lots of types of connection. So I think connection and meaning are the most important things that help us navigate our way out of um, these two, this sort of growing mental health crisis, which again, I think the pandemic has exacerbated. Because to your point, yeah, we lost a lot of the things that might have given us meaning,
Hmm.
and life got kind of boring. There's an interesting old study called the Rat Park studies. I don't know if you've ever heard of them, but when I was when I was in the when I was growing up, just say no was the big drug thing. Just say no, right? And there was a study that was talked about all the time about cocaine. And it basically said if you give a rat cocaine, he will push the cocaine lever until he dies.
Hmm.
And you went, my God, cocaine's a terrible thing. It's a bad drug. And I don't recommend anybody, cocaine is a bad drug, by the way. But the Rat Park studies, that was one of the conclusions of the study. But they left out all the context, and the context is fascinating. The context is if you put a rat in a cage by itself with nothing to do and no connection, and you gave it cocaine, it would press the lever till it killed itself. If you put the rat into a like what they called like a rat park, like a place a rat would want to be, where they've got lots of stimulation and they've got lots of activity and they got other rats to hang out with. If you gave the rat a really good life, most of the rats would just they might hit the cocaine lever again now and again, but they didn't do it till they died. So the context was it was all about the quality of the rat's life that determined whether that rat became an addict or not. And I think we can look at the same thing with mental health, with addiction, all of that, right? Is that the higher the quality of our life, the more resilient we are against those things. And quality of life comes from a lot of different factors, but the ability to, being stuck in a small area all the time, perhaps alone for a lot of people, of course it has a terrible effect on our mental health. So that was a long-winded thing that doesn't really give a short answer to what can you do. And I think the answer is back to where we started the very beginning of the conversation. How do you feed your good wolf? And I said, well, you got to figure out, what does that mean for you? What matters to you? What turns what's your rat park? What's the rat park that works for you? And start to figure out, okay, I can't, maybe the current conditions of the pandemic mean I can't have the rat park of my dreams, but how do I make it a little bit better?
Hmm.
How do I find a little bit more connection, a little bit more meaning? We know that for the pandemic, trying to put some routine in place is really important, because our lives just sort of mushed into this big thing. I know for me, exercise is critical. I sort of look at like for me, there's sort of four foundations to feeding your good wolf, and they're exercise, eating well, sleeping well, and then some sort of contemplative practice like meditation. Those are really boring. Like, I really wish I had better, more exciting things like ayahuasca, um, I'm not saying there's ayahuasca doesn't have its place. I'm saying as a foundation of a life well lived, those things are really important because if you don't feel good physically, you're going to feel bad. You're just going to feel bad overall. How that takes shape might be different depending on your mental conditions, but physical health I feel like is the base of the pyramid that we can then build mental and emotional and spiritual health on.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, man. Just a little routine every day because it starting like every day felt like Groundhog Day since this freaking thing started. Just you wake up, you go to work maybe online, you eat, you watch Netflix, you eat again. It's like just a
Yeah.
continuing cycle. So just breaking that just a little bit is
Yeah.
so huge.
Yeah, I mean, for me, getting outdoors has been a big one. It's one thing that I can do. It's safe to do. You can go. We know that being in nature is really good for us. This has been a good time to try and build a habit like that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, 100%. So Eric, where can my viewers find you and your podcast?
If you go to oneyoufeed.net, that's oneyoufeed.net, you can find access to the podcast, to our social media channels, the various programs, my coaching work, all that stuff.
I love it, man. I'll put that link down below. Eric, this has been a lot of fun, man. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you so much for having me on. I have enjoyed it also.
And to all my viewers, I will see you guys next time. Hey guys, thanks for watching another episode of my show. If you want more episodes of the H Panel, the button's going to be right here. If you want to subscribe for more videos from myself, it'll be right down below. Please like, comment, share, give 5 stars. Let's keep this conversation going, guys, all right? I'll see you next time. Thank you for your support.